The cry pierced the desert silence like a blade through leather. Thin, desperate, barely human. Zeke froze mid-step, his moccasined foot hovering above the rocky ground. In 32 years of tracking game and men across this unforgiving land, he'd learned to trust his ears above all else. This wasn't the call of a coyote or the wind through canyon stone. This was a child. He crouched low, scanning the maze of red rocks and thorny mesquite that stretched endlessly under the merciless Arizona sun. The sound came again, a broken sob that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. Zeke's weathered hand instinctively moved to the bone-handled knife at his belt. In Comanche territory, crying children meant one of two things: bait for a trap or something far worse. The third cry led him to a narrow crevice between two towering sandstone walls. There, huddled in a patch of shade no bigger than a grave, sat a white girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her blonde hair hung in matted tangles around a face streaked with dirt and tears. Her blue dress, what remained of it, was torn and stained with blood that wasn't entirely her own. But it was her eyes that stopped Zeke cold. They held the hollow stare of someone who'd seen death up close and personal. When she looked up at him, she didn't scream or try to run. She just watched him with the weary resignation of someone who had already given up hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked from thirst and crying. "I can't find my mama." Zeke glanced around the desolate landscape, reading the story written in tracks and scattered debris. Wagon wheels had carved deep ruts in the sandy soil before coming to an abrupt stop 50 yards away. Vultures circled overhead in lazy spirals, their shadows dancing across overturned supply crates and personal belongings scattered like fallen leaves. The metallic smell of dried blood hung heavy in the desert air. He'd seen enough Apache raids to know how this story began, but how it ended, that was still being written. The girl clutched something against her chest, refusing to let go even as her small body swayed with exhaustion. When Zeke stepped closer, she pulled back deeper into the shadows, her knuckles white around whatever treasure she protected. "What's your name, little one?" His voice was softer than most would expect from a man whose reputation preceded him across 3 territories. "Clara," she managed. "Clara Henderson." The name Henderson hit him like a physical blow. He knew that name. Every tracker, lawman, and outlaw from Santa Fe to San Antonio knew that name. Judge Samuel Henderson had put a $500 bounty on Zeke's head 3 years ago, dead or alive, though the judge had made it clear which option he preferred. The man had called Zeke a savage murderer from his courthouse steps, promising justice for the death of Henderson's brother during a botched ambush that Zeke had never even participated in. Now, Henderson's granddaughter sat dying in the desert, and fate had delivered her directly into the hands of her grandfather's most wanted enemy. Zeke studied Clara's face, searching for traces of the man who'd branded him an outlaw. She had Henderson's stubborn chin and his steel blue eyes, but where the judge's gaze held cold calculation, hers held only innocent terror. This child had nothing to do with the blood between him and her family, but bringing her home would mean riding straight into a hangman's noose. "Are you going to hurt me too?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. The question cut deeper than any blade. In her mind, he was just another threat in a world that had already taken everything from her. She didn't know that his own daughter had been about her age when fever took her 5 winters ago. She didn't know that her grandfather's hatred had cost Zeke the only home he'd ever known among his adopted Comanche brothers, marking him as a man caught between 2 worlds with no place in either. Zeke knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible. "What happened here, Clara?" "Bad men came in the night." Her words tumbled out between shaky breaths. "They had painted faces and they hurt Papa and Mama. Uncle James tried to fight them, but there were too many. They took our horses and our food and they—" She couldn't finish. Mock Apache raids. Zeke had heard rumors of white outlaws disguising themselves as natives to throw off pursuit, letting innocent tribes take the blame for their crimes. It was a coward's tactic that got real Apache families hunted down and killed by vengeful posies. Clara finally loosened her grip on the object she'd been clutching, revealing a small silver locket. "Mama gave this to me before she—" The chain was broken, the delicate metalwork dented from desperate fingers. In the distance, dust clouds rose on the horizon, riders, moving fast and heading directly toward them. Word of the attack had spread, and now the territory's most powerful judge would be leading a war party to recover his granddaughter. the same war party that would string Zeke up the moment they laid eyes on him. "Clara, I need you to listen carefully," Zeke said, his mind racing through impossible choices. "People are coming. They're going to want to know who saved you." She looked up at him with those haunting blue eyes. "You're going to save me?" The question hung in the desert air like smoke from a signal fire, carrying consequences that would echo across both their futures. The hoofbeats grew louder, at least a dozen horses moving at full gallop across the hardpan. Zeke could make out the glint of rifle barrels and the flutter of a cavalry guidon among the dust. Judge Henderson had called in federal help, which meant this wasn't just a rescue party. It was a war band. Clara struggled to her feet, swaying with exhaustion. "Is that Grandpa Sam?" Zeke's blood turned to ice water. If Henderson was riding with those men, one look at Zeke would turn this rescue into an execution. The judge had sworn a blood oath to see him hang, and finding his granddaughter in the hands of his most wanted enemy would be all the justification he needed. "Clara, listen to me." Zeke gripped her shoulders gently but firmly. "When those men get here, you tell them you hid in these rocks all night. You never saw who killed your family. You don't mention me at all. Do you understand? But you helped me. Promise me." The urgency in his voice made her flinch. "Your life depends on it." The riders crested the ridge, and Zeke's worst fears materialized. Judge Samuel Henderson sat his horse like an avenging angel, his silver hair whipping in the wind, and his face carved from granite. Beside him rode Marshal Frank Dutton, whose reputation for swift justice had earned him the nickname Hanging Frank from here to El Paso. Behind them came 10 more men, a mix of federal deputies and civilian volunteers, all armed to the teeth and hungry for blood. These weren't lawmen looking for justice. They were a lynch mob with badges. Zeke pressed his back against the stone wall, knowing he had seconds before they spotted Clara. Once they did, they'd search every inch of these rocks. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The desert that had sheltered him countless times before had become his trap. "Clara Henderson!" Judge Henderson's voice boomed across the wasteland. "Clara, it's Grandpa. Where are you, child?" Clara's head snapped toward the sound, hope blazing in her eyes for the first time since Zeke had found her. She started to move toward the riders, then stopped and looked back at him. "Go," Zeke whispered. "Don't look back." But as Clara stumbled from the rocks into the open, Marshal Dutton's sharp eyes caught the movement in the shadows behind her. His hand dropped to his pistol, and his voice cut through the desert air like a whip crack. "Judge Henderson, we got movement in those rocks!" 12 rifle barrels swung toward Zeke's hiding place as Clara collapsed into her grandfather's arms. Henderson's face went white as he stared into the shadows where his granddaughter had emerged, understanding dawning in his cold blue eyes. "Come out slow!" Dutton commanded. "Hands where we can see them!" Zeke stepped into the blazing sunlight, his hands raised. The collective intake of breath from the posse told him everything he needed to know. They'd recognized him. Instantly. Judge Henderson's voice dropped to a whisper, filled with deadly promise. "Zeke Running Wolf, you murdering bastard." "Grandpa, no!" Clara's voice cut through the tension like a church bell. She struggled in Henderson's arms, reaching toward Zeke despite her grandfather's attempts to pull her away. "He didn't hurt me. He found me. He was going to help me." Henderson's face darkened. "That savage killed your uncle, child. He's filled your head with lies." "I'm not lying." Clara's voice cracked with exhaustion and desperation. "The bad men came at night. They had paint on their faces, but it wasn't real paint. It wiped off on their clothes when they fought Papa. This man found me crying. He gave me water from his pouch and told me people were coming to save me." Marshal Dutton kept his rifle trained on Zeke, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Judge, if what she's saying is true—" "She's confused," Henderson snapped. "Traumatized. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Clara wouldn't be silenced. With shaking hands, she pulled out her broken locket and held it toward Zeke. "You said this was beautiful. You said it looked like something your daughter would have worn." The words hit the posse like a physical blow. Even the most hardened men among them shifted uncomfortably. A killer didn't speak gently about daughters and broken jewelry. A killer didn't give water to dying children and then tell them to hide his involvement. Zeke's voice was quiet but carried across the desert air. "Your granddaughter is brave, Judge. She survived a night in Apache country with nothing but courage and her mother's memory. You should be proud." Henderson's face worked with conflicting emotions. 3 years of hatred warred with the evidence of his own eyes. His granddaughter, the only family he had left in the world, was alive because of the man he'd sworn to kill. The men who did this, Zeke continued, they're still out there, probably already selling your horses and supplies in Tucson. While you waste time settling old scores, they're getting away with murdering your family. Clara looked up at her grandfather with those penetrating blue eyes that ran in the Henderson bloodline. He's telling the truth, Grandpa. I know the difference between good people and bad people. Mama taught me. The mention of his deceased daughter-in-law made Henderson's shoulders sag. For the first time since Zeke had known him, the judge looked every one of his 68 years. Marshal Dutton lowered his rifle slightly. Judge, we got fresh tracks heading southwest. If we move now, we might catch the real killers before they reach the border. Henderson stared at Zeke for a long moment, decades of hatred battling against the undeniable truth of his granddaughter's survival. Finally, he spoke. Why? His voice was barely audible. Why save her, knowing what it would mean? Zeke's answer was simple. Because she's a child, and children shouldn't die for the sins of adults. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but lasted only seconds. Then Judge Henderson made a choice that would haunt and heal him for the rest of his days. He dismounted slowly, his arthritic joints protesting, and walked toward the man he'd hunted for. 3 years. The bounty on your head, Henderson said quietly, it stays. But not for Clara. She lives because of you, and his voice broke. I owe you a debt I can never repay. Zeke nodded once. Keep her safe, Judge. Teach her to see past the color of a man's skin to the truth in his heart. She already knows the difference. Don't let the world teach her to forget. Marshal Dutton stepped forward, his hand still on his weapon, but his finger off the trigger. Zeke Running Wolf, you're still a wanted man. This doesn't change that. I know. Zeke began backing toward his horse, which waited patiently in the shadows between the rocks. But it changes everything else. Clara struggled free from her grandfather's protective embrace and ran toward Zeke, her small feet kicking up dust. She pressed her broken locket into his weathered palm. So you remember, she whispered. So you remember that some Hendersons are good people. Zeke knelt to her level, his dark eyes soft. I'll remember, little warrior. And when you're grown, you remember that kindness doesn't wear just one face. Henderson's voice was thick with emotion he'd kept buried for years. Where will you go? Somewhere children don't cry alone in the desert. Zeke mounted his horse in one fluid motion. The men who did this, they'll strike again. Check the saloons in Tucson. Look for riders spending new silver and bragging about Apache raids that weren't really Apache raids. With that, he spurred his horse toward the western horizon, where the setting sun painted the sky the color of fresh blood and old promises. Behind him, Clara waved until he disappeared into the shimmering heat, her grandfather's strong arms finally offering the safety she'd thought was lost forever. Marshal Dutton organized his men to pursue the real killers, following tracks that led toward the border and certain justice. They would catch them 3 days later, finding Henderson family belongings in their saddlebags and guilt written across their faces. Years later, Clara Henderson would become the first female judge in Arizona Territory. She would be known for her fairness to all people, regardless of their heritage, and for the small silver locket she wore around her neck, a reminder that mercy and justice weren't always the same thing, but both were necessary for a civilized world. And sometimes, on quiet desert evenings when the wind carried whispers across the sand, she would remember the Comanche hunter who taught her that humanity isn't measured by the blood in your veins, but by the choices you make when no one is watching. The desert keeps its secrets, but some stories are too important to stay buried in the sand.